I took a job watching security cameras at night. One camera shows a place that doesn't exist. My name is Sam, and for 6 bleak, frostbitten months, I worked as a night watchman at a remote telemetry station tucked away in the highest reaches of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The job was simple, almost insultingly so. Sit in a heated booth from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., drink bad coffee, and make sure nobody tampers with the array of antennas and weather monitoring equipment scattered across the peaks. Most nights, the only company I had was the howling wind and the green-tinted ghosts flitting across the dozen monitors in front of me. It was isolating, sure, but the pay was good, and I needed to get away from, well, everything. On my first night, the outgoing guard, a grizzled old-timer named Al, gave me the rundown. He pointed to each screen, naming the camera locations. Camera 1, the main gate. Camera 2, the generator shed. Camera 3, the north perimeter fence. He went through 11 of them, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. Then he paused, his finger hovering over the final monitor in the bottom right corner. That's camera 12, he said, not quite looking at me. The high meadow camera. I looked at the screen. It showed a wide, empty expanse of alpine meadow, dotted with gnarled, wind-stunted pines and outcroppings of granite. The image was crisp, clearer than the others, almost looking like it was filmed in daylight, even though it was pitch black outside. Looks peaceful, I said. Al just grunted, a strange sound deep in his chest. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes dark and serious under the fluorescent lights of the guard shack. Listen, kid, he said, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. I'm only going to say this once. We have a rule up here. It's the only rule that matters. He tapped the glass of the monitor with a thick, calloused finger. The meadow on the screen seemed to ripple under his touch. Never trust what you see on the high meadow camera after the sun goes down. He straightened up, grabbing his worn-out jacket from the back of the chair. It lies, he added, almost as an afterthought. Don't ask me how. It just does. Log any activity you see on the other 11, but that one, you ignore it. You see something on camera 12, you look away. You understand. I nodded, a little bewildered. I figured it was some kind of hazing ritual, a spooky story to tell the new guy to see if he'd get spooked. Sure, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Technical glitches, I get it. Tricks of the light. Al didn't smile. He just stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged. Whatever you need to tell yourself, kid. And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone with the humming monitors and the vast, silent darkness of the mountains. The first few weeks were uneventful, bordering on soul-crushingly boring. I read paperbacks, listened to podcasts, and drank enough coffee to keep a small army awake. The only activity I ever logged was the occasional deer nosing at the perimeter fence or a raccoon trying to pry open the lid of a dumpster. The mountains were beautiful in their own stark, unforgiving way. I'd watch the snow fall on the monitors, a silent, monochrome ballet. I did as Al instructed and mostly ignored camera 12. It always showed the same serene, empty meadow, bathed in that strange, perpetual twilight. I catch myself glancing at it from time to time, though. There was something hypnotic about it. The image was too still, too perfect. The other cameras would occasionally flicker or get distorted by the wind and snow. But camera 12 was always pristine. The branches of the stunted pines never seemed to sway, even when the feeds from the other outdoor cameras showed a blizzard raging. I chalked it up to a better quality camera, maybe a more sheltered location. There were 100 rational explanations, and I cycled through them all. But the feeling that something was off about it never quite went away. It was like looking at a photograph instead of a live feed. A perfect, unchanging photograph of a place I'd never seen. The station schematics didn't even show a camera in that location. When I asked the site supervisor about it on one of his weekly visits, he just waved a dismissive hand. Old equipment. Probably cross-wiring with some defunct Park Service feed. We're supposed to get decommissioned, but you know how it is. Red tape. It was a plausible enough explanation, and I wanted to believe it. The nights grew longer and colder as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. The isolation started to wear on me. The silence between the howling gusts of wind felt heavy, oppressive. The green glow of the monitors became my entire world, and my eyes kept getting drawn back to camera 12, to that peaceful, impossible meadow. I started to notice things, small things at first, things that couldn't be real. I remember thinking about AL's warning, never trust what you see on the high meadow camera after the sun goes down. It seemed so ridiculous at first, the kind of superstitious nonsense you'd expect from an old mountain hermit. But as the nights wore on, I started to wonder. I started to feel like I wasn't just watching the screens. I felt like something was watching me back, and it was watching from that quiet, empty meadow on camera 12. The meadow that, according to every map and every schematic, wasn't even there. The first time it happened, it was so subtle, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. It was about 3 weeks into my contract, deep into a Tuesday night, or maybe a Wednesday morning. The days had started to blend together into one long, continuous stretch of caffeine-fueled solitude. A storm had been battering the station for 2 days straight, a relentless assault of wind and snow that had buried the access road and turned the world outside the guard shack into a swirling vortex of white. The other 11 monitors showed a blizzard in full fury, grainy images of fences disappearing under drifts, antennas swaying violently, and the occasional, unsettling shape of a snow-laden tree branch scraping against a camera lens. But camera 12, as always, was a picture of tranquility. It showed the high meadow under its usual, eerie, day-for-night illumination. There was no wind, no snow, just the silent, still trees and the pale, rocky ground. I'd been staring at the bank of monitors for hours, my eyes dry and stinging from the artificial light. I was in that strange state of half-awake, half-asleep that defines the graveyard shift, where your mind starts to play tricks on you. I glanced down to make an entry in the logbook. 217, continued heavy snowfall, winds gusting to approximate 60 miles per hour. And when I looked back up, I saw it. On the screen for camera 12, right in the center of the meadow, was a single, dark shape. It wasn't large, no bigger than a bird, maybe. And it was just there. It hadn't been there a second ago. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. I was sure it was just a smudge on the screen, or a dead pixel I hadn't noticed before. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the cold glass of the monitor. It was no smudge. It had depth. It had form. It looked like a rock, a small, dark stone that stood out against the pale, almost luminous ground of the meadow. But I knew every rock, every stunted tree on that feed. I had stared at it for countless hours. That rock was new. My heart started to beat a little faster. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a piece of debris, a chunk of bark, had been there all along and I just overlooked it. It was a perfectly logical explanation. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the other monitors. I watched the snow piling up against the generator shed on camera 2. I watched the main gate on camera 1 become almost invisible behind the curtain of white. I busied myself for a good 10 minutes, making a fresh pot of coffee, stretching my legs, walking the small perimeter of my heated cage. I was actively trying to forget about the little dark shape on camera 12. When I sat back down, my eyes went to it immediately against my will. The rock was still there, but it had moved. It was now a few feet to the left of where it had been before. My breath hitched in my throat. I stared, unblinking, trying to will it to be a trick of my tired eyes, an optical illusion created by the screen's refresh rate. But it was no illusion. The object, whatever it was, had definitely changed position. I stood up and paced the small shack, my boots thudding softly on the rubber matting. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation. An animal? No, it was too still, too uniform in shape. A piece of trash blown by the wind? The feed showed a complete lack of wind. The trees were as motionless as statues. Could the camera itself have shifted? Unlikely. It was a fixed position camera, and the rest of the landscape in the frame was exactly as it had always been. I felt a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. AL's words echoed in my head. It lies. Was this what he meant? I sat back down, my eyes glued to the screen. For the next hour, I didn't look away. I just watched that small, dark object, and it didn't move again. It just sat there, a silent, inexplicable anomaly in a place that didn't exist. By the time the first hints of dawn started to break, painting the snow-choked world outside in shades of gray and blue, the object was gone. It hadn't moved again, it had simply vanished. One moment it was there, the next, the meadow was as empty and pristine as it had been for the past 3 weeks. I stared at the screen, my mind a jumble of confusion and fear. I felt a profound sense of unease, a feeling that I had just witnessed something I was not supposed to see. I never wrote it in the logbook. How could I? 2:17, small rock appeared in non-existent meadow. 2:27, rock moved. 5:45, rock vanished. They would have pulled me off the mountain for a psych evaluation. I told myself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and isolation. It was the only explanation that made any sense. But as I sat there, watching the sun rise over the frozen peaks, I knew, deep down, that I wasn't just tired. I was scared, and the long nights ahead suddenly felt a whole lot longer and a whole lot darker. After that first incident, the meadow on camera 12 became an obsession. I tried to follow AL's advice. I really did. I tried to ignore it, to treat it as a dead screen, a phantom signal from nowhere. But I couldn't. It was like having a locked door in your house. Eventually, you have to know what's behind it. The sense of normalcy I had carefully constructed around my isolated job began to crumble, flake by flake, like old paint. The storm that had brought the moving rock finally broke after 4 days, leaving the station entombed in a cathedral of silence and snow. The supervisor called on the satellite phone, his voice crackling with static. He said the plows wouldn't be able to clear the access road for at least another week. I was on my own. The news, which should have just been an inconvenience, sent a fresh spike of anxiety through me. The isolation was no longer a choice. It was a cage. The second event happened 2 nights later. The sky was clear, and the stars outside were a brilliant, cold fire. On the monitors, the landscape was bathed in the pale, ethereal glow of a full moon. I was doing my rounds, virtually switching between camera views, when I landed back on camera 12. The meadow was as it always was, still and silent. But there was a smell in the air, a faint, cloying scent like damp earth and something sweet, something rotting. I sniffed the air in the guard shack. It was impossible. The shack was sealed tight against the cold, the air recycled by a noisy heater in the corner. There was no way a smell from outside could get in. I checked the vents, looked for any cracks in the window seals. Nothing. The smell was definitely inside the shack with me. It grew stronger, a thick, vegetative odor like a cellar that hadn't been opened in a century. My eyes were locked on camera 12. And then I saw it. The ground in the meadow, which had always been a flat, pale expanse, now looked disturbed. In one patch, near a gnarled pine, the earth looked darker, wetter, as if it had been recently turned over. It was a subtle change, one I would have missed if I hadn't been staring at that feed for weeks on end. As I watched, a faint, almost imperceptible vapor seemed to rise from that patch of disturbed soil, curling in the still air on the screen. The smell in the shack intensified. It was nauseating, the scent of decay. I felt my stomach lurch, and I had to cover my nose and mouth with the sleeve of my jacket. My mind reeled, trying to connect the impossible, the image on the screen and the sensory experience in my sealed room. How could a visual on a monitor produce a physical smell? It defied all logic, all reason. I wanted to look away, to switch the monitor off, but I was paralyzed. The vapor on the screen seemed to thicken, coalescing into a faint, shimmering haze just above the ground. It It was like heat haze on a summer road, but there was no heat here. This was a place of deep, unnatural cold. The patch of dark earth seemed to pulse, a slow, rhythmic beat that I felt more than I saw. It was a soft, sickening rhythm like a diseased heart. Then, the satellite phone on the desk rang, a jarring, electronic shriek that shattered the silence. I jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs. I snatched the receiver, my hand trembling. "Station," I croaked, my voice hoarse. There was nothing but static on the other end. A loud, hissing roar of white noise. I shouted into the phone, "Hello? Who is this?" But the static was all-consuming. And then, through the static, I heard something else. It was faint, buried deep within the noise, but it was there. A sound. A low, wet, dragging sound. It was the sound of something heavy being pulled through mud, a rhythmic, scraping noise. My blood ran cold. The sound was coming from the phone, but my eyes were fixed on camera 12. The patch of disturbed earth on the screen, the vapor, the smell, it was all connected. I slammed the phone down, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The static cut off, plunging the shack back into silence. But the smell remained, and the dragging sound. I could still hear it, not from the phone, but in my head. A faint, persistent echo. I stared at camera 12, at the dark patch of earth. It looked like a fresh grave. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was looking at a grave. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the shack, as far away from the bank of monitors as I could get. I refused to look at camera 12 again. The smell of rot and damp earth lingered for hours, a phantom presence in the small room, before finally, mercifully, fading with the dawn. The week of isolation stretched before me like a prison sentence. The snow wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was a shroud. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I barely slept. When I did, my dreams were of a silent, twilight meadow and the sound of something being dragged through wet soil. I rationed my coffee, my food, but more importantly, my glances at camera 12. I'd cover it with a piece of cardboard, but my curiosity, a morbid, self-destructive kind of curiosity, would always get the better of me. I'd peek at it, my heart pounding, needing to know if anything had changed. The patch of disturbed earth was always there. Sometimes it seemed fresher, darker. Other times it looked as if the ground was settling, sinking slightly. The station's power began to flicker intermittently. The generator would kick in with a roar, then the main power would surge back, making the lights buzz and the monitors reset. Each time they came back on, I'd hold my breath, terrified of what new detail might appear on camera 12. The third incident was auditory. I was reading a tattered paperback, the words blurring in front of my tired eyes, when a sound came from the main console's small speaker. It was a single, clear note, like a small bell being struck. It wasn't part of the usual hum and crackle of the equipment. I looked up at the screens. Nothing seemed out of place. The wind was calm. The fences were still. The meadow was empty. Then the bell rang again. And again. It was a pattern. A simple, three-note melody, played over and over. It was faint but clear. I traced the sound to the speaker for the external audio feeds. I cycled through them. Camera 1, the gate. Only the faint sigh of the wind. Camera 4, the main antenna, a low electronic hum. I went through all the legitimate cameras. The sound wasn't coming from any of them. With a sense of grim inevitability, I activated the audio feed that was for some reason linked to camera 12. The schematics showed no microphone at that location, just like they showed no camera. But when I flipped the switch, the three-note melody filled the shack. It was clearer now, pure. A lonely, haunting sound like a child's toy. And underneath it, a faint, almost subliminal whispering. I cranked the volume, my ear pressed against the speaker. The whispering was indistinct, a sibilant, rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It wasn't English or any language I could recognize. The bell melody continued its relentless, hypnotic loop. I stared at the meadow on the screen. The place was as still and lifeless as ever, but I was listening to its voice. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It rose in pitch, the sibilant hisses turning into something that sounded like pleading. A chorus of faint, desperate voices, all talking over one another. And then, a new sound emerged from the cacophony. A child's laughter. It was high-pitched and joyous, but it was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It was completely, utterly wrong. It didn't belong in that dead, silent place. I recoiled from the speaker, scrambling back in my chair. The laughter echoed in the tiny room, sharp and piercing. It seemed to mock the desolation on the screen. I looked at the image of the meadow, at the patch of disturbed earth, and a horrifying thought took root in my mind. The bell, the laughter, they were the sounds of a nursery, a playground. I shut off the audio feed, my hand slamming down on the switch. The silence that rushed back and was almost as deafening as the noise had been. But the laughter, it didn't completely go away. I could still hear it, a faint, tinny echo at the very edge of my hearing. I was starting to lose my grip, to question what was real and what was a product of my frayed nerves. I remembered AL's warning, his solemn, tired face. Never trust what you see on the high meadow camera after the sun goes down. You should have said, or what you hear. The final incident before the climax was the one that broke me. The snowplows had finally cleared the road, and the site supervisor was due for a visit the next day. I was counting the minutes until I could see another human face, until I could pretend that the last week had been nothing more than a bad dream. The power had been stable for a full day, and the strange phenomena on camera 12 had ceased. The meadow was just a meadow again. The disturbed earth seemed to have settled, almost gone. The audio feed was silent. I allowed myself to relax, just a little. I made myself a proper meal from my dwindling supplies and even dared to turn on the small radio in the shack, desperate for a human voice. The signal was weak, mostly static, but I found a station playing old country music, and it was the most beautiful sound in the world. I was cleaning up, my back to the monitors, when the music on the radio abruptly cut out. It was replaced by a high-pitched squeal of feedback, and then a voice. A clear, calm, female voice, like a dispatcher. Unit 734, respond, it said. Signal active at the old park grounds. Repeat, signal active at the old park grounds. I froze, a dirty coffee mug in my hand. I turned slowly to face the monitors. On the screen for camera 12, something had changed. In the center of the meadow, a single, dim light was now glowing. It was a small, yellow light, like a lone candle flame in the immense darkness. As I watched, it began to blink, slowly and rhythmically. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. It was a signal. The voice on the radio spoke again, her tone unchanged. Signal confirmed. 3 pulse beacon. Standard recovery protocol is now in effect. Stand by. My blood turned to ice. Unit 734. The old park grounds. Recovery protocol. This wasn't a cross signal. This wasn't a glitch. This was communication. I was intercepting something. Something official. Something that knew about this place. My eyes were glued to the blinking light on the screen. Who was it for? What was it signaling? Then I saw the movement. It was at the edge of the frame, a flicker of motion in the shadows beneath the gnarled pines. It was tall and thin, a vertical slash of darkness that detached itself from the deeper darkness of the trees. It didn't walk like a person. It moved with a smooth, gliding motion, unnaturally fluid, like a piece of film being run in reverse. It drifted from the tree line out into the open meadow, moving toward the blinking yellow light. It was too dark to make out any details. It was just a silhouette, a man-shaped void. But it was tall, far too tall. Its limbs were long and slender, its proportions all wrong. It had no discernible features, just a vaguely humanoid shape that seemed to drink the light around it. It moved without a sound, a silent, gliding nightmare. It reached the blinking light and stopped, standing over it. The radio crackled to life again. The dispatcher's voice was still calm, but there was an underlying edge to it now, a tension that hadn't been there before. Beacon has been reached. We have visual confirmation. Subject is on site. There was a pause, filled with the hiss of static. Then she said a word that made no sense. Is it hungry? Another voice answered, a man's voice, distorted by the radio. Always. The tall, thin shape on the screen bent down. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost reverent. It reached out with a long, spindly arm, and the blinking light went out. The meadow was plunged back into its perpetual twilight. The figure remained there for a moment, a statue of black against the pale ground. Then slowly it turned its head. It had no face that I could see, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was looking directly at the camera. It was looking at me. The radio crackled one last time. It was the dispatcher. Protocol complete, she said. Wipe the feed. The screen for camera 12 went black. Not to static, not to a no-signal message. Just pure, absolute black. I stood there, trembling, the coffee mug falling from my nerveless fingers and shattering on the floor. I had not been watching a glitch. I hadn't been hallucinating. I had been watching a designated, monitored site. A place where things were recovered. A place they could simply wipe. I was not alone on this mountain. And whatever was out there in the darkness knew I had been watching. The supervisor was coming in the morning. I didn't know if I would live to see it. The final hours of my shift were a fever dream of terror. I didn't sit down. I paced the confines of the small shack like a caged animal, my eyes darting between the 11 remaining active monitors and the dead, black square in the corner where camera 12 used to be. Every creak of the building in the wind, every skittering sound on the roof from a loose piece of ice, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The silence from the console, once a comfort, was now a threat. The dead feed was not an absence of signal. It was a presence. A deliberate, menacing blindness. I kept thinking about the dispatcher's final words, wipe the feed. It was so casual, so procedural. It implied a routine, a knowledge of what that place was. And the figure, the tall, slender, faceless thing that moved like smoke. What was it? The subject? What was the blinking light it had extinguished? What kind of recovery protocol were they following? The questions hammered at my skull, each one more terrifying than the last. The man's voice on the radio, answering if the subject was hungry. Always. My shift was supposed to end at 6. The supervisor, a man named Henderson, was scheduled to arrive around 7 to relieve me, his truck grinding its way up the newly plowed road. All I had to do was make it until then. Just a few more hours. But the darkness outside the shack's small, reinforced window had never seemed so absolute, so filled with potential malice. The station was a tiny island of light in an ocean of hostile wilderness, and I felt its flimsy walls pressing in on me. At around 4:30 a.m., it began. A low, rhythmic thumping sound. It was distant at first, so faint I thought it was the generator cycling. But it wasn't mechanical. It was a heavy, deliberate sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from outside. My heart seized in my chest. I scrambled to the monitors, my shaking hands flying across the console, switching camera views. Camera 1, the main gate. Nothing but snow and moonlight. Camera 3, the north perimeter. Empty. I scanned every inch of the station's grounds visible on the screens. There was nothing. No tracks in the fresh snow. No sign of movement. But the thumping was getting louder. Closer. It had a weight to it. A sense of immense power behind each impact. It sounded like a giant, soft hammer striking the frozen earth. Then, a new sound joined the thumping. A high-pitched, metallic screeching. It was the sound of tortured metal. I flicked the view to camera 6, which covered the tall radio antenna at the edge of the compound. The antenna was swaying. Not from the wind. The night was perfectly still. It was swaying violently, as if something enormous was shaking it from its base. The guy wires groaned, stretched to their breaking point. The screeching was the sound of the bolts being torn from the concrete foundation. I watched, mesmerized with horror, as the 100-foot steel tower bent, its red warning light at the top swinging in a wild arc against the starry sky. And then, with a final, deafening shriek of tearing metal, it fell. It crashed down onto the roof of the main building, the one that housed the primary equipment, and, somewhere deep inside, my little security booth. The entire shack shook with the impact. The lights flickered violently, and half the monitors blinked out, their screens dissolving into static. The thumping stopped. An unearthly silence descended, broken only by the crackle of static from the dead screens and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I was trapped. The main exit from the station was likely blocked by the fallen tower. The power was unstable, and something was outside, something that could topple a steel antenna like it was a child's toy. I grabbed the satellite phone, my only link to the outside world. I punched in Henderson's number. It rang once, twice, and then a click. But it wasn't Henderson's voice. It was the calm, placid voice of the female dispatcher from the radio. "We are aware of the situation at your location," she said, her tone utterly devoid of emotion. "Please remain calm. Do not attempt to leave the security office. A team is en route." "What is happening?" I screamed into the phone. "What is out there?" "That is information you are not cleared for," she replied coolly. "Your feed from camera 12 was not properly wiped. This is a containment issue. Stay inside the room. Do not open the door for any reason." The line went dead. Containment issue. My blood ran cold. The feed wasn't wiped. They knew I had seen it. This wasn't just a random event. This was because of me. The thing outside wasn't just passing by. It was here for me. A scraping sound started at the door of the security shack. A long, slow, deliberate scrape, like a single, massive nail being dragged across the reinforced steel. The sound vibrated through the floor, up my legs, into my teeth. I backed away from the door, pressing myself into the far corner of the room, my eyes wide with terror. The scraping was followed by a soft, inquisitive tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was gentle, almost polite, a complete contrast to the violence of a moment before. I held my breath, praying it would go away. The room grew cold. Not just the chill of a mountain night, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to suck the warmth directly from my body. I could see my breath fogging in the air. The humming of the remaining equipment faltered. The lights dimmed to a dull, orange glow. The frost began to crawl across the inside of the window, delicate, feathery patterns of ice spreading with impossible speed. Then, the handle on the steel door began to jiggle. Slowly at first, then more violently. It was being turned back and forth, tested. A low, guttural sound rumbled from the other side, a sound of frustration. The jiggling stopped. There was a moment of silence. I prayed, it had given up. The steel door bowed inward. A massive dent appeared in the center, the metal groaning in protest. It was hit again, and the door flew from its hinges, crashing into the bank of monitors with an explosion of sparks and shattered glass. I screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. Standing in the ruined doorway was the figure from the meadow. It was just as I'd seen it on the screen, but now it was real, solid, and filling the entire frame. It was a towering, skeletal thing, at least 9 feet tall, its limbs impossibly long and thin, jointed at unnatural angles. Its skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over a frame that was barely there. It had no face, just a smooth, blank expanse of skin where features should have been. And it emanated a cold that was so intense it burned. It took a step into the room, its strange, jointed legs moving with that same smooth, gliding motion. It had to stoop to get through the doorway. It turned its blank head towards me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze lock onto me, a gaze of ancient, implacable hunger. The room was filled with the smell I had experienced before, the smell of damp earth and rot, but it was 1,000 times stronger, a physical presence that choked me. I was paralyzed, pinned against the wall by a fear so absolute, it was like a physical force. This was it. This was the end. The creature raised one of its long, spindly arms. At the end of it were not fingers, but 3 long, black, chitinous talons that slowly, almost delicately, extended. It drifted towards me, the only sound the faint, dry rustle of its parchment skin. It was going to recover me. It was going to contain the issue. And I knew, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, what hungry meant. I survived. I don't know how, not really. As the faceless, skeletal thing reached for me, its talons just inches from my face, a blinding white light flooded the ruined security shack. It poured in from outside, accompanied by a sound so loud, so high-pitched, it felt like my skull was going to crack open. It was a piercing, electronic shriek that vibrated in my very bones. The creature recoiled from the light, letting out a silent, agonized scream. It had no mouth, but its whole body convulsed, its blank face contorting as if in immense pain. It stumbled backward, its fluid grace gone, replaced by a clumsy, desperate scramble. It was like watching a predator suddenly become prey. It flailed its long limbs, trying to shield its featureless face from the unbearable light, and through the shattered doorway, I could see the source of the light. 3 figures, clad in black, featureless tactical gear from head to toe, were advancing on the shack. They carried strange, bulky weapons that glowed with the same intense white light. They moved with a chilling efficiency, forming a semicircle around the entrance, cornering the tall creature. They didn't shout or communicate. They just moved, a silent professional unit. The creature, caught between them and me, seemed to fold in on itself. The intense light and sound were causing it to dissolve. Its parchment-like skin began to smoke and flake away, like ash in a strong wind. Its form wavered, becoming translucent. For a terrifying second, I could see the remaining monitors and the wall behind it right through its body. It let out another silent scream, and then it was simply gone. It didn't run or teleport. It just ceased to exist, leaving behind nothing but a lingering, bone-deep cold and the faint, sweet smell of decay. The 3 figures swept the room with their light weapons, the beams passing right through me without effect. One of them stepped forward, their face obscured by a black, reflective visor. They knelt and picked something up off the floor near where the creature had vanished. It was a small metallic disc. The figure looked at it, then looked at me. I couldn't see their face, but I felt a gaze that was cold, analytical, and utterly inhuman. The figure spoke, its voice filtered through a comm unit, a flat, synthesized monotone. The asset is lost. The witness is secure. He then raised his weapon and pointed it directly at my head. I closed my eyes, expecting the end. Instead, there was a soft hiss and a sharp, stinging pain in my neck. The world dissolved into a dizzying, gray spiral, and I collapsed into darkness. I woke up in a hospital bed, not a local one. There were no windows, and the walls were a sterile, seamless white. A man in a plain gray suit was sitting in a chair beside the bed. He introduced himself as a representative from the company that owned the telemetry station. He told me there had been a severe weather event. A rare form of ball lightning had struck the main antenna, causing a massive power surge and structural collapse. He said I had suffered a concussion and was lucky to be alive. He said I was a hero. He said my contract was being terminated, but I would be paid in full for the entire year, along with a substantial bonus for my trouble. All I had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement, a very, very thick one. He explained that due to the sensitive nature of the government equipment at the station, my silence was a matter of national security. I signed it. What else could I do? Argue? Tell them I saw a 9-foot-tall, faceless monster get disintegrated by men in black with light guns? They had already given me the official story. It was a story designed to be told, to be believed. My story was not. They let me go a few days later, dropping me off in a city hundreds of miles from the mountains. The money was in my account, just as they'd promised. I've tried to move on, to build a new life, to forget the things I saw. But I can't. I can't forget the still, silent meadow on camera 12. I can't forget the smell of the earth, the sound of a child's laughter in the static, or the dispatcher's calm, cold voice. Sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I feel a familiar chill creep into the room. A cold that has nothing to do with the temperature. I'll catch a faint scent of damp soil and rot on the air. I see long, thin shadows moving in my peripheral vision. I know they're watching me. The containment issue wasn't the creature. It was me. I'm a loose end. I never found out what that place was. An entry point? A prison? A feeding ground? I don't know. But I do know that the world is not what we think it is. There are dark places, hidden from view, monitored by people we will never see. And there are rules. Rules that are there for a reason. I think about Old Al, the guard I replaced, and the one piece of advice he gave me. The advice I didn't follow. I think about it every single day, because I learned the hard way what it meant. And I'm telling you this now, hoping you'll understand. There are some things you're not meant to see. There are some places you're not meant to know exist. So if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, if someone gives you a strange, simple warning, I'm begging you, listen to them. Never trust what you see on the high meadow camera after the sun goes down.